So I think I will just start talking so that people will hear some sound and will return to the hall. It was an extremely interesting and inspiring morning. Thank you very much to all the speakers. It's really extremely generous of all of you, not only to come to Venice or to Mestre to be part of this event, but also to share your thoughts. And obviously, you have prepared yourself very well, so that's really this debate and discussion about our subject can be happening. I can maybe say a few words about our motivation to have this event. There is quite a sort of literal, let's say, story to it, in that we, that is Lucas, Luisa, and myself, have decided some time ago to change the structure of the office. We used to be a partnership of few, and we had some associates as well. And we decided to propose a kind of more open partnership, which would involve more people in a kind of leading role, if you like. And that's what we put on track about 2 years or two years and a half ago, and we are in the middle of this transformation. And of course, so that it has been mentioned this morning, that it means that it's a special moment for our practice. We are at a moment of change, and of course the exhibition providing a kind of retrospective kind of view into the history, if you like, and this kind of moment of change is really something that feeds into the question of what are we actually going to do in the next decades, and what are these new partners going to be able to achieve in their careers and in the kind of next 30 years of the office. And this is actually a serious question. It's not just a rhetorical one, because we are at the moment experiencing an enormous amount of change. Luisa and I have both been teaching, and I've been teaching probably something like 20 or so years all in all. But we decided to dedicate ourselves. We have always, in parallel, always been running the practice, and the practice, if you like, was some kind of reality check to what we were doing with our students. At the same time, what we were doing with our students was a kind of like a research, a kind of something that was pulling the practice along as well. So there was a kind of duality all the time. But some time ago, we decided to dedicate ourselves to practice only, partially because we were starting to be a bit tired of the kind of dual demands. And so what we kind of think or write or kind of discuss in occasions like this is very much colored by the experiences that we make with our clients, with our office, with the consultants we talk to, with all the influences that one is exposed to if one is practicing as an architect. And in the last, let's say, 5 years, or maybe 10 years, but it's becoming more and more urgent, like hearing an enormous amount of signals that seem to harbinger fundamental change. I mean, obviously, digitization has been mentioned this morning, and I just say the word BIM, and you know what that means for many offices. And BIM is only the beginning, I think, of a development which is going to change our way of working quite fundamentally. But there is probably most dramatic and most urgent of all is the question of climate change. And we have been engaged in research and also prototypical work trying to cope with the questions of energy consumption, of carbon dioxide emission, and so on. But as we all are discovering, our efforts are not successful enough and probably also not efficient and fast enough to really make a difference. So that now the debate is kind of heating up, and the office is experimenting with various routes, using, for example, timber as a building material for quite substantial projects, which normally would not be associated with timber at all. And also kind of now, most lately, question of circularity. I mean, just 2 days ago, we had a meeting with clients in Zurich who are very serious about cataloging all elements that we are going to use in a new building. And this kind of question that was already raised earlier of demountability, a kind of an architecture that can be taken apart again and be used as a source for raw material, is being addressed quite seriously. But the results are also an enormous amount of, like, let's say, bureaucracy, or whatever you want to call it, because all of this is, of course, work. I mean, the ideal idea, for example, for this is that you have like a database which runs parallel with BIM, so that in a way you can not only at any point in your design process establish quantities, like, you know, how much brick or how much concrete or how much timber you're using, but you can also at the same time establish the circularity index and the carbon dioxide emissions. All of this, of course, requires an enormous amount of basic work because the basic information is not readily available. And it means that the quantification of design is probably increasing rather than decreasing. Eric has been speaking about some of the effects of, let's say, commodification of the building process, and the question of, you called it value engineering, which is really friendly for cost cutting in the process. And of course, this question of having to put numbers to everything that you do. But I mean, this is going to probably increase, and the facade specialists and of course quantity surveyors in the Anglo-Saxon system will be accompanied in the future by a kind of sustainability and circularity specialist, so that the design process is going to be more complicated. And of course, already now, I mean, we had a kind of very, say, playful workshop with our team 2 days ago, but the service engineers are already telling us now that we should be putting, for example, structural members on top of each other in order to avoid unnecessarily carbon dioxide emission. So there's a, I was like 2 nights ago in Berlin, there was a lecture that Klaus Bollinger gave, Klaus Bollinger and Grohmann, great engineers actually, and he was showing his work with Korb Himmelblau from the 90s and the turn of the century, and he was kind of like the most extreme example was not just the Musée de Confluence in Lyon, but also a kind of 90-meter cantilevering roof in a cinema palace in Busan in Korea. And so he was showing those examples, enormous steel structures, really, really daring, really incredible, and then ended the lecture on modular timber housing and this kind of demand of reducing energy consumption and so on. And I asked him actually and reminded him of this letter that Le Corbusier wrote once to les messieurs les architectes, reminding them of the building of the structural engineer as a model for their endeavors, i.e., economy of means, optimization of material, and out of that an aesthetic of an optimized aesthetic of a kind of much reduced kind of language that is coming down to its very basic elements. And I was asking him the question whether he thought that the engineers were still able to provide that example to the architects? Obviously a rhetorical question. And as a matter of fact, as far as the immediate experience goes, it's the service engineers and the process engineers which are going to feed the design process in the kind of inverted real world that we are engaging in. Is that a good thing? And is the poetry that we were debating this morning going to survive that kind of purge of efficiency and economy? These are really serious questions, and I think Anlin was talking about my shock of listening to members of the BDR. BDR really is the sort of holy grail of architecture in Germany. I mean, it's not just the Chamber of Architecture, but it's a sort of select, meant to be exclusive club of the best architects of the country. And young members who stand up and say, well, we should really be caretakers. We should be facility managers. The question really is, and I mean, this is a position that also was taken up by Ecke Krasny, who showed the article in Arch Plus. There was an exhibition which they showed, which was called, what was it called? The Care Turn, yes, exactly, kind of showing many examples of architects engaged in community work and indeed anything or many things but building. So these young architects, I seriously think, are fearing for architecture to be associated with climate change, where they see architecture as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And they really almost kind of anticipate already their own defense when they will be speaking to their grandchildren by kind of taking a position of passivity. But then at the same time, I mean, obviously the world of construction is not going to change and is not going to take much interest in a few young architects who refuse to get involved in construction. It's not going to change its ways. So, I mean, unless there are operators, there are people who engage in this debate and really try and shift the route and take up the position of the poet, to put it kind of slightly melodramatically, we will not kind of be able to achieve the type of quality, the type of environment that we think to be necessary. So we, at the end of our knowledge, our wisdom, if you like, and we are really seeking the advice of our friends and colleagues who have been watching these changes as well. And so therefore we're very, very grateful to have this group of friends here today to talk and throw around a few ideas and not necessarily come out with the solution, but maybe reaffirm our kind of missions and our interests from particularly a different kind of point of view. So without much more talking, I could go on for a while. I would like to ask Pippo Ciorra to take the stage. Pippo is obviously best known because he's the chief curator of Maxi in Rome, the museum by Zaha Hadid, which has had very successful and beautiful programs. Pippo is also an educator. He's teaching here in Italy and has been teaching in the United States. And he's just a great guy. He's the only person I know who's done an architecture congress on the beach. And we were kind of very honored to be part of that 2 years ago. A very pleasant experience, combining serious thought with some very good food. And I'm very happy that people came here. He has an exhibition on the late work or the work of Aldo Rossi at the moment, and had some lectures last night in that context. And it's a very nice sacrifice you're making for us to come to Venice, especially for this talk. So please, Pippo.
Thank you, Matthias. Grazie. course, I will speak German. Grazie moltissime for many reasons. First, for inviting me. Grazie a Matthias e Luisa, grazie a Luca and Dario, everybody who's been organizing this, Livio, extremely accurately. Thanks also because it's not usual that a firm of architects doing an exhibitions about their own work produce a theory book instead of a catalog. So this is an act of extreme generosity. And also a theory book in a city in which school the word theory hasn't been allowed yet. So it was never allowed in Venice. So it's a new thing. You know, that's probably why we're in Mestre and not in Venice. Exiliated. And also, no, my friends know I rarely wear colors, but as a tribute to you, I got some socks today. So I'm ready. I won't be long. I will tell you small things. Also, I have a disease. When they give me a theme, a topic, I need to stick to that topic. Otherwise, my sense of guilt becomes too big. So I will speak about education. And after what everything was saying, Matthias, now everything I heard in these beautiful presentations in the morning, it's not easy to understand what we can teach to our students in these days, where we have to push them, what we can give them, or what we can just help them to find on their own way. So we'll tell you just about 3 little stories. Stories about education. I will not tell you if I'm a practicing architect or not, because I don't even know, actually. I'm not sure. I'm mostly a curator and educator in these days. And the 3 stories, they all take place in this context, which is where I live, where I teach, and where I probably found the most sexy experience of sprawl city in Europe. No? I think it's a very, very interesting metropolis, 300 kilometers long, going from Ravenna to Puglia in a very strange and interesting way, which we discuss in another symposium. But anyway, yes, we live in this. It's strange. The Marche and the regions around it are very strange because this is on one side the area where the great Italian Renaissance urban culture was born, if you think of Urbino, but also when you have the toughest sprawl condition around. So, I mean, it's better than Veneto because in Veneto, the distance between the factory and the street is even less, where there is still some landscape here. But it's a very intense and interesting way of living an urban space. So it's continuous, it's strange, it has a lot of landscape, it has a lot of production, a lot of rivers and valleys and ugly houses. It has all. I live here in the top right hill, but you also have beautiful medieval characters. You have this touristic sprawl all over the place. You have ghettos, no, like touristic buildings that became ghettos. So the first time we really, I mean, I came from Rome. I have no idea what my country was like in terms of, I mean, Rome, you think architecture is made of monuments, that the city is a city, that the landscape is a landscape, the countryside is a countryside. When I arrived in this area in the early 80s, I understood the things were much more complicated. That the urban is also rural, that rural is also historical, that's wilderness, and with the same house you can do a shop, a living place, a mini factory, and also keep doing your farming. So in 1999, this was the 90s, somebody was saying this morning, the 90s was a lot of fun. We were very, very interested in chaos. We were very interested in we liked ugliness, basically. You know, we were very much in search and falling in love with ugliness in the 90s. So I took my students and the students from Ohio State University, which was a school where I was teaching when I was young. They used to come to us, and we designed an exhibition space in one of the internal piazzas of a shopping mall. There was a lot of form finding at the time, and so the students ended up with this project, which was a 2-story thing, actually, and then they built it. No, it was very much about not design and build, but desire and build, no, as an experience. It was interesting. It was very good for them to have this experience, but it was also very strange because when we asked for permission, we had permission immediately that we could do this. But then when they started to build, the guys in the shops were not happy at all. So the thing ended up in physical fight. And somebody went to the hospital, because of this. But then we had our thing. We had Frau lending us the armchairs for the opening, and I was happy with the thing. So the first idea was to discuss what public space. This was the time when Remkulas would be going around saying that shopping space was public space, but then shopping space public space had a conflict, in this occasion, and this was very, very interesting. But we didn't care where public space were at the time. The shopping mall. This was when Mirko, Stefano, I were doing Simposio, traveling on the highway from Milano to here, stopping in gas stations, airports to give lectures. The second interesting thing, which is probably what Matthias and Luisa know better, is this project we do every year on the beach in Senigallia. Senigallia is a very interesting city on the Adriatic. It's a 25,000 people city with 7 Michelin stars, just to start. And it's a beautiful place where every event comes naturally and well. So because I like the students to develop theories. I like to listen to our theories. I like them to be curious, to question themselves, but I like them to still be attracted by the thing, by the idea of building, by the idea of doing something, and to do something for the space where people live. So still very much about the idea of public space in a sprawl, elongated sprawl, where public space is very much an idea which is only belonging to historical sites. It was interesting to develop an idea of a contemporary public space by using a public space which is dead for 9 months a year. So we chose a beach, we invite a lot of people, we invite a lot of friends, we implore friends to come and speak 2 o'clock in the morning. With the Mirage is a very good restaurant in front of this place. And we are now at the 11th edition of this. So the idea is we did open competition for students before, then we build what the students design. Now we found a different protocol, so we work with a single school every year. They do a competition in the school, and then we did it with Royal College, we did it with the Croatian school, we did it with UAB last year. So it's very interesting because it gives the students the possibility to build something, to do something. Every year I do the Young Architect program at Maxi and the Manio Marittimo on the beach. And generally the thing by the students is more interesting than what the Young Architects do in the Maxi. Also because probably work under Zaha's roof is more complicated than working on a beautiful beach. But anyway, you see how it works. It's the beach, it's the small street. It's one row of houses that goes on for 10, 20 kilometers. The railway, the State Street, a little bit of landscape, and the highway. So it's like the perfect section for the coastal sprawl. And in one of these ugly houses, there is the most sophisticated seafood restaurant in the country. This is very interesting. No, Moreno. And it was always very, very beautiful because the students really fell in love with the project. They build. We have a wonderful company that help us to build the thing, and we have like 80 guests in one night. So it's extremely tiring for me and my friends organize the thing. But you really feel like you're creating public space, like you're creating a situation where the people can meet, can talk. I see friends here that were not only Matthias and Luisa, but young people were there this summer. And it was nice this summer because we were going back to a real thing in presence. So it's very important. And for me, it also gives me, this is kind of an alternative idea of teaching or doing pedagogy in a very strange and unprecedented, I would say, condition. Also because it's real. It really modifies the life of people. And also, one of my boring lectures is the permanent value of temporary architecture. Now, this you can feel absolutely clearly here that you have given another identity to that space, that identity stays there the whole year, even if the thing happens one night from 6 o'clock in the evening to 6 o'clock in the morning, which is when I dive in the water. And I think this is still a different way. It's not simply transferring knowledge. It's not simply sharing what you know, but it's also learning from what they do, learning from what happens on the field, and working on the edge. I mean, it couldn't be more edgy than this. No, you're on the edge of a country, on the edge of the land, on the edge of the water, on the edge of the day and night. No, so it's quite interesting. This was the most beautiful one I remember. It was only by lights. And yes, then one night we had Daniel Libeskind. I said, Daniel, you come, but you do not speak about your architecture. So we spoke about music and its relation to music. 2 o'clock in the morning was a lot of people. Then in 2019, Luisa and Matthias were there, and a lot of people came. But I mean, again, it's pedagogy, no? It's something you do with students. It's something you challenge students to do, and you learn by doing it. And also, these are Luisa and Matthias. You can see them. This is what you were talking about before. It was a beautiful light installation by this team of students from Zagreb, and we were very happy. I mean, it's something I do for a double reason, because I want to work with the students to their own education, but I want to change something in the territory I live. So it's global and local in a very practical way. No? So this is why we do it. This is why we spend a lot of time, sometimes even money, to do it. The third episode is more like academic, and it's now exhibited in that questionable space, which is the Italian pavilion in the Biennale, which I'm sorry, but this is my country sometimes. This happens because, as many of you know, 4 years ago now, Diane Lewis died in New York. Diane was John Hyhook, like closest assistant. And some of the students from Diane, especially Yael Sansos, this woman teaching in Lausanne, was in the photo with her last child. She wanted to make a tribute to produce a tribute to Diane. So she invited 12 teams around the world, and we were invited. I mean, she was inviting like architects and teams. I decided that I thought I wanted to do this with students, so we involved the students. All these are non-curricular projects, so they don't bring any credit. They have no revenue, no like bureaucratic revenue for the students. So if they do it because they want it. It's because it's their own project. So we decided to work. The idea was, again, an investigation on civic space, on public space, was typically Diane Lewis. These are the students in Venice, just because we opened this like 2 weeks ago. So we decided to work on this building. This building is extremely interesting. The first time I put my attention, it's 15 kilometers from my house, so I know it very well. It was built as a super luxury resort at the beach in 1970. Now it's the worst slum all over the coastline. It has like it's like the Unité d'Habitation, because it's 1,600 people and like 45 different nationalities. It's interesting because it looks like a cross, like a Corbu building, but it's actually 2 L buildings. So 1 L is more families, so more established, more taken care of. The other L is more people passing and going, especially in the summer. So it's more like anarchic and complicated. This is a photo by a wonderful Italian photographer, Olivo Barbieri. A few years ago, I had Olivo doing one of these city projects on the whole Adriatic strip. So we found helicopters for him, and he did like helicopter and stills. We asked Olivo to use this photo. This is like the schematic idea of the metropolis we live in, a very non-dense metropolis, but also a place, they can testify a place with an incredibly high quality of life, no? So you have this typical contradiction that Matthias was somehow, and I mean, it's a beautiful place, you have everything, you have history, you have wonderful food, you have the beach, you have tourists, but then you have to use your car to go around most of the times. So the hotel house is out of Porto Recanati, so it's separated from the city. This is from more or less where I live. You can see it in the horizon, and this is the contradiction from the opening to the end. So we did research with the students. They were, of course, very much into the 9 square grid poetic or poetry, as it was in the morning. So we started from Nolli, of course, which is a 12 square grid, which was exactly what Yael was asking us to produce, a 9 square grid. So we went through Roma Interrotta, of course, which is a first experiment of critical investigation on the Nolli map, on the existing. And then all the students made their own 9 square grid analog experiments to find ideas and etc. Of course, the most important thing was not the quality or beauty of architecture they were producing, but this is developed in something we invented in the master program, which is like platforms for the students. The student, when he registers into the master program, they can choose between climate platform, heritage platform, and city platform. I run the city platform. And again, everything they do in this thing is theirs and bring them no credits. So we started to work on the hotel house. We knew the story very well. And we decided we had to work with program. So what do we get left? Maybe one of the things we get left is program in architecture. So we had nine students, nine spots in the building. So every student had to work in his own square and to parasite the building with something that could help the building to become. So what did we think? We thought we can't build this building in the city. Let's in the building. So let's make, instead of a bosco verticale, we wanted to do a borgo verticale, no? Somehow. So we thought you could have like language teaching, you could have culture, you could have energy producing on the roof, you could have theater, you could have workspaces. There are already workspaces in the building, but of course illegal. Public space, education, sport, a market, and playground. So every student developed one of these topics. We worked all along the year in stealing times in the school schedule. And then we came out with this kind of collage, no? As Roma Interrotta, there is an interesting connection, I think, from Roma Interrotta to our like cadavere squeeze, no? In the end, it's like a cadavere squeeze. Again, I think this was not important because you have to like it or not like it. The project, it was important for the process, for this idea of collective design, for this idea of involving the students in this. I mean, every one of them did their own project, and they were showing themselves, they were exhibiting their ideas and turning their ideas into a project. We were forced into the 12 square grids, but we liked it, so we prepared our panel for the Biennale, and we are squeezed. If you go to the Italian, if you really have to go to the Italian pavilion, and you go, then you find it in this little vicolo, no? In the. I mean, it took 15 minutes for me to find the spot where the place is exhibited. But then, so again, we had 9 projects doing one project. No? This kind of ambiguity, and we liked it very much. So, and also it was an investigation on what architecture can be today. Now we are here because we don't know exactly what architecture will be in 10 years from now and in 20 years from now. I really feel this angst now when I'm with my students because I don't know what their role in society will be 15 years from now, 10 years from now. Now in Italy, they have this terrible, like, issue that they can get money to do this kind of house updating energetically, and the families get money, the architects get work. It's like very low profile work. And in 4 years, this will end. And so we will have thousands of architects who will not know what to do. Italy has, I wrote a book on this. Italy has 165 registered architects, which means UK plus Spain plus France plus Germany to get to this number. In a country where every other graduate, high school graduate, engineers, agronomists, they are all licensed to do buildings. So it's a difficult landscape. But anyway, what could architecture take care of in the future? Culture. Now we are very much investigating this idea of regeneration by cultural projects, as everywhere in the world. In Italy, it's becoming something really interesting. Energy, we all have to do. This was my second exhibition at Max, energy. Performance. These are all things where architecture can be part of a dialogue. Workspace is a big topic, of course, today. Luis and Matthias are super expert. Public space, education. Again, education is I think the only antidote to all the bad, ugly things are happening in the world today is education. Education. I think what government, we should all go to Rome, to the G20, to tell them that the good thing to do is to put money on education. Sport and taking care of their own bodies. A market. This place already has informal markets, so it really makes sense from like every ethnies in the world. Playground and so on. So there was the exhibition, there was big discussion, but there was a symposium. But anyway, for me, it was a pedagogic experience to develop with my students. So what do we learn from this? How can we connect education and architecture? What are the concepts that can help us to think about architecture in these days? So the first thing is this is very delicate, but I know Gundula is going to throw a shoe to me, but we have to forget Italian urban design knowledge. There's no way we can work with this anymore. Most of this country is built. There's really no room. You can substitute something, but you have to understand that we started from that. These are the same region. These are the same area. This is the same place in the country. Urbino, la città ideale, the ideal city is the source of all our knowledge. We agree on this. But now we deal with this, which is a completely different thing. We know we don't have the political, economical, sociological, even philosophical power to turn this into this. There's no way. We can do this in our schools, but then it will last very little. You can do a little exhibition, of course. So the city, and we don't know what. I think we live in this place. We need to deal with this countryside issue that Rem brought up last year. 2 years ago now, because there was the COVID in between. But we live in this we don't know what, urban, non-urban, rural, productive landscape every day. And so we have to deal with this every day. And it's very, very interesting, I think. Also because, I say it again, the quality of life for the people living there is extremely high, extremely high. I choose to live there. I work in Rome 4 days a week. I work in Ascoli 2 days a week, but I want to live on that hill. Well, the hill is more beautiful than this, yes. Publics versus private. We are dealing with a lot of blurring boundaries, Blurring boundaries as a very important way of seeing things today. So we don't know exactly what is private and what is public today. This was very much the 90s, the shopping mall issue and the public use of private space. But again, our life is flowing today on 2 dimensions, the analog one and the digital one. And this double condition, of course, blurs a lot of edges, a lot of conditions, a lot of boundaries. So we need to talk this. I mean, we are very happy that technology is helping us to stay at home and do our job at home. But modernity, democracy, public life rely on the fact that in the morning I wake up and I go out of my house, I meet other people, I have a workplaces where I interact with other people. If I will not leave my home, not even to work, this is a very strong threat, I think, to democracy. And sometimes in the last, intellectuals in the last 10, 20 years have not been paying enough attention for me to the risk that democracy is running in these days. And this could be also a discourse that can ramificate in many, many areas. Permanent versus temporary, of course, I see in the eyes and in the mind and in the desire of my students now an approach to what it will be their own career, where you cannot really rely on this decision. I'm doing a building, I'm doing an exhibition, I'm doing an installation, I'm doing something that turns this space into something else. It's open. I think it's open. We don't need to be rigid on this, I think. Day versus night. I mean, there is the architect. Somebody was talking about time this morning. Matthias was talking about time. I think time is an extremely important issue today. I mean, cinema is being suggesting this a lot in the last years. Since we're not controlling space anymore, we're trying to control and manipulate time. This is a very interesting topic, I think, for architecture theory today. Now, and digital life, I mean, I was giving reviews 7 o'clock in the morning in Australia and 2 o'clock in the night in Los Angeles. I didn't like the project in any of the two occasions, but in the same day, you know? So I'm joking, of course, but the schedule is true. So time is something completely different that we thought in modernity. Existing versus new. I think we are getting used to a different idea of newness. For us, new meant a new build. Years where my voice is. In 25 years I've been teaching in these schools. My students have never done a project from scratch. Never. Because the corpses, the ruins, the archaeology is so abundant that you need to do something about it, because otherwise the waste will be really, it's not preservation that will be overtaking us. I think it's waste which will be overtaking us. And of course, the first show we did in the museum when I started to work there was this idea of recycle, where recycle was not simply an ecological idea, but the recycle was an attempt to bring together something that we were not able to bring together in the last century, so conceptual and phenomenological. So recycle for me was the Gioconda with the mustache, but at the same time was the real idea of reusing materials. There are wonderful companies in Venice that make their life just by recycling the materials from the Biennale. No? You know, the kids know this very well. And the project, of course, in Hotel House was a typical experiment in this area. Communication or language. I mean, in the 20th century was the first thing I felt when I started to conceptualize about being in the 21st century. My museum is called the Museum of the Arts of the 21st Century. Was this idea that the 20th century was about dialectics, either or synthesis. The 20th century was about mass, where the 21st century is about an infinite series of individuals. Social networks make this terribly visible. But also 20th century was about language. I was teaching in Ohio in the 80s, so I mean, 21st century is completely different for me. There's not this idea of either or. There's not this idea of putting our lives together to become a critical mass in the political life. I mean, I love my daughter's generation. She's 29. She was 29 today. I was forgetting her birthday. She sent me just a note with 29 written. And she's turning 29. But I think they are extremely sensible. I think they know how to live their time. I think they're politically, ecologically, socially, genderly, whatever, correct, but they don't know how to put their energy all together to become a critical mass that has an impact on society. They hate our politics. I mean, it's very strange for a boomer like I am, because we never thought that architecture was anything else than politics in our history, in our life. We wasted a lot of good things after this in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it's very interesting. So I think the device to turn individual will into collective will is still to be found today in the age of social media. I think this is a very interesting topic too, which I'm not able to develop, but I saw it. So, of course, it's much easier to fall in love with Stefano's trees because they are pure communication than with a building. But if we want to talk about our wonderful guests, I think their work is extremely appropriate today, extremely contextual to our time, because they don't need to look like themselves. No, I mean, Aldo Rossi needed to look like himself. He wanted to look like himself every time. No, it's Wittgenstein. I always say the same thought. I always think the same thought. The time today is different. The best Italian architects I prefer and support are people you're not even able to tell it's the same architect in the next project. Camaleontico, no? I think this is very interesting. This is very much our time. And we have to find, and good architects are able to build a thread even without this kind of a linguistic obsession that we had in the 70s and the 80s and so on. But this is another wonderful field of research and investigation, I think. And then nature, I mean, this summer, the manual was a forest, was done by U of students. And it's totally the paradox of ecology, because you have to take away plants from arboretum and to put them in the sand with a very violent act to state ecology, no? So there is a lot of paradox in it, and it's very interesting. And communication compensates for the brutality of the jazz. But ecology is also Arnold Schwarzenegger presenting his third hammer fueled by hydrogen, no? So we need to commit to this, but we need to keep our eyes open. We need to go into the thing. We need to. I have problems with my. I mean, this is a public confession. But sometimes I have problems with my president of the museum, because she asked me, Pippo, why don't we deal with nanotechnologies? Why don't we deal with, I don't know, brain surgery? I say, well, I'm not entitled. There are other people that know these things better than us. So all these things, technology, ecology, sociology, whatever, whatever issues that create our aura today, our cloud of ideas today, we need to deal with them, and we need to try to understand what they mean for us, for our knowledge, for the little things we know. I mean, because there are little things we know and we are useful to the world. We find a place in the world if we keep using these little things we know about the space where people live. So this is, I think, what is going to do. Again, I'm preparing a show on engineering. So, And of course, for my president, it's a show on artificial intelligence. For me, is mostly a show on, but it's not about structural engineering anymore. It's about many other things. So this is very interesting. You know it. This is a robot checking construction sites at night when there is nobody there. You can imagine now if you connect this robot to the GIS. I mean, this is a little bit scary in the end, no? Yes. And Boston Dynamics, it is scary somehow. So I think this is the landscape of ideas we move around. This is what we're trying to understand. And I think pedagogy is a beautiful tool to invest in this condition because they have wonderful energies and they are more natural than us in this world. But I think we can bring to them some footnotes coming from our architectural experience and ideas and whatever we have in mind. But I still think, yes, I was never for autonomia in my life. I hate autonomia. But I always thought that architecture has to have a dialogue with the other knowledges, but we need to keep something that is what we know how to do and we can give as a gift to the rest of the human beings somehow, and maybe non-human beings, yes, to the rest of the world. Grazie. Well, I close with a down. There was this artist who was rotating around himself for 45 minutes, like 3 years ago. Homa?
Thank you very much, Pippo.
Homa now? You need this?
Thank you very much for your fantastic excursion into not just pedagogy, but I mean a whole world of thoughts, which I think are extremely, well, I think both confusing and encouraging at the same time. So I'm very happy to ask Georg Vrachliotis to the stage now. Georg is another great guy. I don't know how we met each other, but some time ago anyway. And okay, well, he also contributed to this book that we produced, The Turn of the Century, and he wrote a really, I'd say, scary introduction in a very nice piece. Maybe you tell them about this as well. Anyway, he's been teaching, he's been writing, he has very good books, actually, I recommend highly to you. And he's just recently been snapped up by Delft University as their digital man. So here's Georg.
Thanks, Matthias. Luisa and Matthias, thanks for having me. You know that this is a fantastic and a special moment, I have to say. But you know that we have met 20 years ago. You don't know this, but I met your building, the GSW, the GSW Hochhaus in Berlin. And actually, I didn't, met you or you, Matthias, but it was the place I met my wife for the first time 20 years ago. And and another draw, laugh, and build story began. Another level, of course. Now we're in Rotterdam. That's the final chapter of this journal. And I have to admit that I feel a bit bad after all these beautiful lectures, and especially after the first session about poetry and all these, beautiful things, the soft, let's say, descriptions of our reality, the desires of our discipline. Because I have to, but I want to speak about the dark side, all these, you said scary things of our world, because I believe that we have to address them in order to describe them. So I really try to describe what's going on to then, formulate the critical point. So I believe in description as a medium of critique, and that's one of the reasons why I'm totally okay with describing data and the so-called digital and the robot, the scary gadgets you mentioned. So I'm fine with that because I'm always optimistic. You know, that's the point. That's the point. So let's talk about the dark side, which I call the technological unrest. And then, of course, the question: what is design in the age of data, right? So, as Antoine Picon, architecture historian in Boston, but also in Paris, put it a few years ago, our world today is an heresy of the universe opened up by cybernetics and electronic art in the 50s and 60s. But who would have thought, Picon continues, that digital life would get under our skin to this? And it doesn't take long, of course, to realize that this is a pretty rhetorical question that is completely in step with our times. The radical nature of the question is already evident in the fact that even the idea of digitalization creeping under our skin is no longer a metaphor. For some time now, as you know, we have been experiencing new cultures, forms of recoding spaces, objects, forms, images, social media, you mentioned materials, and even the human body, if you think about the robots. So the idea is, or the hypothesis that that architects have become curators in a data-driven world. It seems so. So design has become a matter of data management, from building standards and participatory user behavior to the integration of climate data. The question is, what new culture, aesthetic, social, and political paradigms will this lead to? And what does it mean to educate future architects to design for a data society that seeks its balance between AI, migration, and ecological awareness? So what does this mean for the future of our discipline? Historically, the question about education in media has experienced many ups and downs. In the late 60s, for example, there was an open talk of a crisis, the university education of architects. Like always, like we're always in crisis education. This is the kind of educational constant of our discipline. There was the impression prevailed that they were lagging behind progress. That's always the impression somehow. We are behind the things. This becomes clear when one takes a look at the magazines of that time. Architecture was even in a so-called underdeveloped state in terms of methodology, in terms of theory, in terms of methods. And behind the so-called facade of a still high social prestige, one suspected an extraordinary, desolate state of practice and education. Such formulations were symptomatic of the mood of upheaval in education at that time. The answer was not long in coming. Architecture education had to become mobile, as we can see here, and the architect had to redefine his tasks. They were convinced the build profession would disappear, as so many other professions have disappeared. The antidote was quickly found. Back then, the development of new kinds of subjects, such as information theory or cybernetics, promised to fill an important gap in education. Indeed, the turn to science or turn to technology promises to this day, we have to say, to provide the crucial operational attributes that are repeatedly called for in heated debates about education: efficient organization and control on the one hand, and methodological integration and interdisciplinary on the other. Of course, there were a lot of critiques of these developments, even then. Many resisted the idea of being squeezed into a supposed corset by industry on an academic stage, illuminated by technology. Today, almost 5 decades later, as we all know, we face very, very different challenges. And while we'll still like to rack our brains over the question whether or not data is suppressing the humanistic core of our discipline, the entire Earth is being digitally scanned. We are now witnessing how once big, bulky computer machines are losing weight, but gaining all the more in power. They sensors have emigrated to populate our environment, creating their own algorithmic ecosystems and powerful infrastructures. And while smart dust blows like a warm technological wind through our buildings, cities, and landscapes, our behavior, communication, experiences, and even emotions are being stored, analyzed, and evaluated as quantifiable patterns. The random noise of datafication is around us, yet so far we can neither experience it nor grasp it directly. What we are now left with is a critical look at our screens. That's the digital unrest. But digital unrest means also never being sure what you see, even if it looks like reality. So the question is, of course, how can we work on a critical, productive, and without anxieties reflection of these developments, without getting lost in dogmas, which is this software is the only solution, without getting lost in nostalgias, which is we must protect the humanistic core of our discipline by ignoring technology, and without getting lost in platitudes, which is it is always about surveillance and it's always the fault of tech companies. So that's the big question. What we are perhaps missing is a powerful narrative, a story of why we should care about data. We must maybe discuss an idea beyond the standard argumentation of optimization or efficiency. Data is a question of design and society. In other words, it's about mindsets and not data sets. The UN, for example, recently published a series of reports describing the different possible uses of data technologies for public purposes and civil community projects. The publications are part of a Global Pulse initiative, that's the name, launched by the UN Secretary General a few years ago, and are based on two pretty remarkable basic assumptions. First, the data will be harnessed safely and responsibly as a public good in the future. And second, that the data offers the opportunity to gain better understanding of changes in human well-being. In contrast to the current situation where it's mainly private companies that capitalize on big data technologies, this approach emphasizes the enormous potential and use of data as a freely available resource for culture and the common good. And that means also for design and architecture, of course. It's a vision, but this vision is about the idea of developing a new open structure for our future data-driven society. And so UN's main question is, how can citizens be involved in collecting community-level data and mapping their own living environments, and how can they then use this information and planning for the future? Of course, we have to pose the question, what would that mean for design education? And how would the role of the architect change? And of course, what would a world look like in which all data about our buildings, cities, and the environment was not a private economic resource, but was instead freely available? Depending on the context in which we speak about an open society, the notion of the idea of open also changes, however. It makes a big difference, for example, whether the political basis of a democracy, the economic principle of a market economy, or the handling of personal data is the topic of our discussion. This is also indicated by the UN study mentioned at the beginning. The studies appealed comes from the initially somewhat dystopian sounding idea of a civic open data society in which data would be treated as a public good. In such a future, architects would have access to more and more data concerning our environment, for example, about the global consumption of sand, the formation of microplastics in groundwater, the toxic properties of certain building materials, or the behavior of people in cities. Designing as culture technique would be based on a new data-driven and ecological foundation. And I would like to propose 3 lines of thought, 3 challenges, of course, big challenges, about the productive potential of these new foundations. An open society is considered one of the most significant civil society-oriented projects we have inherent from the last century. For the future, the significance of this idea of open society lies in our collective responsibility to constantly and critically question and reposition the concept of openness, of course. The 21st century will require us to develop new concepts for thinking about design in a data-based and an ecological way. Researching and tracing where all the stuff we carry around us in our iPhones and computers comes from will have a huge impact on design and society. The work of French journalist Guillaume Pitron, for example, as well as other journalists who focus on resources, forms the basis for what I would call the new enlightenment or the big picture. We can, if you like, but only if you like, the idea of the new enlightenment in an open data society can be mentioned at the same breath as Buckminster Fuller's world game simulation, even if such connections always seem a bit awkward in view of the rapid technological progress of the world. Another line of thought, and the slides are a bit mingle, but no worries, is the reinvention of the building. Because contrary to the notion that the building would dissolve into the branches of communication networks, there now seems what I would call the reinvention of the building, but in an open data society, and that means the building has a new technological condition. And I think maybe it's time to stop, just maybe, dreaming the wonderful techno-utopian dreams of the 60s. Maybe it's time to gratefully reject Hans Hollein's pill that everything is architecture, almost as if we need a clear mind to master the current challenges. Dreaming of an open society as a project is one side of the coin, of course. The question of what it means to design in such a data-driven society, or even how we can produce meaning from this vast amount of environmental data, is the other side. And maybe, and this is just a question, of course, maybe in the future we will not be able to avoid new AI methods because human intuition will eventually reach its natural limits when faced with so much data. We are collecting more and more data about materials, the environment, and the climate. But the faster this data is collected, the more likely we are to be confronted with the limitations of our own ability to make judgments, to create sense, to ask for meaning. we will have to admit to ourselves that we will neither be able to evaluate and judge the complex structure of an open data society without automated analytical capabilities. And so it seems we are facing a new technological dilemma, or as I would call it, another chapter in the long history of technological unrest. But of course, no worries. This is by no means just a question of technology. Data and all these technological unrest would offer us a thought-provoking opportunity to rethink and to reposition fundamental architectural concepts such as shelter, comfort, privacy, mention time, the public, or even the human body. Thank you.
Georg. As you didn't explain it, I will quickly kind of offer an addendum to your lecture, which is introduction of his piece in the TOC reader. Is a text that sounds as though one of us had written it. As a matter of fact, I thought, when did I read this? When did I write this? I can't remember exactly, but it sounds like it. And actually, it was a piece of text that he had commissioned from one of his AI programs after feeding some written stuff from us, and they synthesized this, and it's really pretty close. It's quite eerie. Yeah. Anyway, I would like to invite Homa Farjadi to the stage. Homa and I go back a long time. We meet each other every year in London, and we have been sort of friends and connected ever since. She lives in London, but also in the United States. She's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And she's teaching at Princeton GSD, various other universities in the States, but also in Europe. And it's a great pleasure that she's here, great honor that you made the long journey for us. And we're much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Luca? Oh. Very grateful for my invitation. Very happy to be here. Delighted to see this project and the exquisite exhibition upstairs. And actually joyful reconstruction of a city center, which has been done so wonderfully. I really, it was a treat all by itself, worth making the long trip. And thank you to Livia and Bettina for showing us a lot, which really enjoyed it. I talk as an architect, as a teacher, professor of architecture, and also as a practitioner, though not at that kind of grand scale. Nevertheless, very much feeling that my position as a teacher is very much based on what I claim to practice. So when I am trying to teach architecture, this is mostly graduate students, and I teach a research studio. So basically every year, every semester, American semester, I set a research theme And the theme has a sort of dialogical construct in the sense that it offers two texts to the studio, one in written word and one in design. And the idea is, and they are not to do with things that are necessarily related, it's purely my choice. And their, let's say, dichotomy might just as much be the reason for their choices. And they're asked to think of them as two discourses, historical of different times, and to make a project out of it. So we discuss these as matters that positions our design practice, our role as designers into question. I am not actually going to show you the students' work, but I'm going to explain what is one of the kind of tools of our thinking in this process. This year, I happen to have given them this topic, the quasi things. And it is that which I want to explain to you, because I believe that it matters beyond education for us, at least the way I see it, in as much as every time we sit at our desks, we of course do theory, but I believe theory for architecture also happens every time you're at your desk. So you think why you do things and how you do it and in what way you frame your position vis-a-vis what you decide to do aesthetically, making form. This morning, we're talking about all of these coming down to exactly how you decide to go about design or making form for that matter. So this is my little effort in actually orientating not only my class, but myself, and every time it's a research for both of us along the way. This exhibition, of course, is a very lovely framing, the topic, Draw, Love, Build. The three acts, hard to imagine aligning with much of built environment, unfortunate as it may be, this building excluded. One has to look for them, and when you find them, some loving, patient hands behind them, some possible, becomes possible to detect, to imagine. Yes, I suppose ideas as imagination do need the hand, the digital tool, the techniques that enable them to imprint the drawing, the sketch, plan, diagram, working drawings, details, etc., as we have witnessed probably in this building and the exhibition upstairs, enabling the patient love to translate them into buildings, things of architecture of all sorts. Yet, loves involves another, the displacement of the self, the condition of subjectivity which overrides the self and the willful subjecthood. Architecture has often ascribed this supreme agency to the designer, the author of the work. Yet as architects, we're also aware of the translation along every step of the way. Other agents, which are intended or by chance mutually at work in this process. Draw, yes, we know, is more than solving problems. It is a projection, an imaginative wandering into domains of the possible, poetic or not, to create new territories, mixing times, enabling shifts, displacing selves, to imagine where others and the self can come together. So it is in this spirit of the symposium's questions regarding the contemporary condition of architecture, the turn of the century, state of things in our discipline, that I propose the concept of quasi things to be potentially useful in their construct of time, the contemporary. So, Michel Serres calls it the chaotic contemporary, chaotic time. His formulation of the contemporary form, contemporary from the 20th century, quite early on, frames cultural consideration of the contemporary in relation to prehistory of science. Of course, he is originally a historian of science and then a mathematician, but nevertheless a philosopher, a cultural historian now. So his aim was to override the linear conception of time in these epistemological frames of rupture and advance. So when we say, what is now, what do we do now, as opposed to modernisms or 10 years ago or 60s, etc. He points to clouds, flows, fluxes, meteors, fluctuations, turbulences, and chaos in consideration of the world at its emergence. The contemporary in his formulation is but of a chaotic order, if only for the multitude of ways we remember and forget, learn and sublimate what we know. The bicycle, he suggests, this is just random photo of a early bicycle. A bicycle, he suggests, is an example, an assemblage of chaotic time. One part turn of the century, Carnot's cycle 200 years old, engineering of it probably 19th century. The wheels dates back to Neolithic times. He is reminding us how the past is no longer out of date. And that is that in each advance, there is amnesia, things that are lost. So in his formulation, quasi thing, as a category, he recollects this chaotic nature of knowledge and its relation to time of the contemporary. So for us, this is very useful in as much as there is a certain kind of category of object that is primary in the consideration of what becomes a scientific or cultural object. Serre recognized quasi-objects to hold agency as physical, social, and environmentally active subjects, that they remain between the subject, author, agent, and the performative object. He referred to parasites, gifts, religious objects that prompt new paths of performative communication between subjects and objects. The simple example of the ball, as in football, offers an object which transforms relationship of bodies in space, of territoriality, of the group that becomes an intersubjective collective as a result of their relationship to the performance of the ball in space and time of the game. You can think about our architectural practice as whether we do it simply at our desk or in the office, pretty much that kind of a game. But also our buildings, if you like. So the question that we turned to our studio was exactly what are the ways in which architecture addresses the problem of quasi things, this open system of performative conditions. In architecture, quasi things formulated by Tony Grifero, Gernot Boehme, among others, are called out as producers of atmospheres. Atmospheres do not aim to be new. And this is something that in architecture, we are kind of, as you know, since modernism, we're quite obsessed by it, what is new and how you value it. technologically or formally, but offer open, quasi things, offer open, diffused configurations within live ecology of things. They surround us and affect us as we perceive them through, though never as a singularity. Atmospheres, therefore, refer to environments of diffused objects in relation to what is called spatial effect of felt things, a sort of affective term. There are spaces of hybrid performance, eroded, opened up limits, diffused objects. Emotional as well as functional conditioning of pre-modern or technologically advanced environments, environment of quasi-objects. Atmosphere also relates to sensorial conditions which take accent away from the representational, the image, to the perceptual and emotional content of space. So this is a sort of run-through of a collection of instances of what we think spatial quasi things might be like or what be about. So the first one talks about the question of disappearance, of time of disappearance, like the wind that comes and goes. We feel it and it leaves nothing behind. So these are immaterial objects, and this is a sort of photograph I found of this habit, I think in the Inuit culture, where they in fact lean their bodies against each other and it becomes a chair temporarily and then disappears. So the object is actually in the kind of alignment of forces in certain amount of time and then not. This is a photograph I found by a Iranian photographer, Golestan, who photographed these women in Iran, outside of the city of Tehran, after the revolution, obviously, as you can see, people in their chadors, women in their chadors, and nevertheless, in the kind of high post-revolutionary Iran, they're not supposed to do anything. Women are not supposed to be adventurous and do sports, or nevertheless, not even, go out in the open on their own. And here there's some defiant women who have decided hypergliding is their favorite sports. And they take to the mountains outside Tehran and set up a little thing with the picture of Khomeini at that time, so that they legitimize certain sort of cover for their temporary use of space. So it's a certain kind of deterritorialization of what is the landscape of free space outside of the mountains in Tehran, of landscape. And of course, they are detected, the police come, and then they wrap and they leave. But nevertheless, they actually have managed to get on with their chadors on the gliders and then use the space as they wish to. So there's a sort of the edge of illegality to it. So another category is the sort of idea of informal ecologies. This was a tradition that land used in mostly in America, but also then later in Europe, which explored these kind of diffuse landscape of natural landscapes, outside control, and informal operational environmental space. Just as an example, you probably know this, Michael Heiser, who is one of the sort of interesting land art artists, a lot of them went to the American Southwest and used this, this is in the Salt Lake in Arizona, and this is called motorcycle drawings, that he literally used his motorcycle on the surface of the salt lake, which is pretty much an untouched kind of landscape, and did these rounds of sort of rides on the surface of the salted earth, and produced these kind of drawings, which obviously has a very specific kind of scale and relationship to the landscape of the nature as a found nature. So this idea of the role of the body, or the drawing here is not your wrist or your hand, but your full body on a motorcycle that becomes, assumes a very different relationship to the drawing, an act of drawing. So it's a performative kind of experiential thing of this new horizon and a different scale. Another one of the land artists is Robert Smitson, who kind of explored with, I'm sure you know his spiral jetty, etc., but one of his found kind of chance works, if you like, is this shed, is called partially demolished shed, which he caught when he was teaching in Kent University, Kent, America. And he saw this at campus when a shed, a very kind of unintentional design object, architecture, was being taken over in the process of demolition by the earth that was filling it in or displacing it. So this idea that architecture starts to happen beyond the intentionality of the author and design, and it's sort of a chance encounter between informality of the operation of demolishment and the actual thing that has been there, no matter that it's a very kind of, let's say, low status design content. Another one of these examples of sort of found encounter with nature or with, let's say, geological formations is this instance that of sort of, these are some, you can hardly call, it's on the edge of what you can call architecture, because they're like semi-intentional things. They find these, this is a village which is pretty much, has been there for more than 1,000 years. It still works. It's still lived in Sabalan, Azerbaijan, in Iran. And when I visited it, they still were villages with their animals and their agricultural products, etc., and even their shops that actually had found these spaces. It's a kind of cave, but they actually cut the caves into this geology of this mountain, and it becomes a hybrid between what is a found landscape of a mountain and what is a part of their space-making operations, a hybrid of the cave and architecture added to it. So this notion, again, of finding in geology and in nature something that can start to make a different process of, or hybrid of intentionality of design into what becomes a kind of architectural hybrid. So I am obviously, you must by now sort of have detected that I'm actually interested in the way in which each of these objects are finding their own kind of turbulent references without having sort of foregoing with the intentionality of the design process. And so this, as found, is one of the topics that those of our friends who have been involved with Smitson would recognize very well. And Louisa has already written about this, which Smithsons were very interested in the way that they would, it would welcome, their work would welcome the question of the incidental, the everyday, and that which is outside of what is designed. So what we were shown this morning of the whole archive of incidentals and references outside of what is normatively architectural precedents becomes so activated and appropriated into what is a design exercise. So it's a sort of a delay and a displacement of the role of us as designers, authority, as agents of design. And of course, this is what was shown this morning, this upper lawn pavilion, which is a lovely kind of thing. There is huge amount of beautiful photographs online about it now that has been restored in England. But this idea that they found this, this wall that was a sort of landscape wall in a courtyard, in a landscape of agricultural landscape, and then they appropriated into their situating their design of the pavilion against it or onto it. So this is what you see of its product. So let's say the idea of its technology or material system or the way in which these two come together, they become very hybridized and very much, let's say, open, as they both become open systems that address the environment in relation to the surrounding landscape, to the work of the sun and the snow, etc., in very specific ways, shadows that they produce. This is one of our old projects, which also was exploring this kind of incidental break in the topography of the landscape. A fall into the landscape becomes appropriate as a structural sort of support, and then a pavilion, which was for an entrance into a park. So there is another category of quasi things, which I believe are interesting in as much as there are some kind of vernacular, and it's agricultural, industrial. And the vernacular, as you know, it has a certain kind of slow shifts in its cultural, aesthetic, functional know-how, and is opposed to what we call singular aesthetic agency of us as architects. So on the left is a sort of shed, and the issue of shed is very interesting for us because it already has a diminished design intentionality of configuration in it. But it also becomes interesting because we see that what is otherwise called the facade is not there or is accumulated. The storage itself becomes a material system. The actual temporality of it is always shifting. So the turbulence in what is the stability of an object is always performatively transformative. And of course, this vernacular of the barn was a topic that we worked on the year before, or many kind of iteratively in a couple of studios, which has its own kind of not only attitude towards the know-how of the detail or the material system or the environment within which it happens, but also it's a cultural knowledge that is participatory. So they actually, as you know, communities, this is like raising of the barn in American system. I'm sure it's equivalent of it happened in the barn came from Germany and Switzerland, etc., originally, and France as well, to America. But in here, it moves from region to region. Nevertheless, it's always a participatory act of a social encounter for the collective, the community, and they share that knowledge and pass it on in generations. They become, it has a slower transformative design content. A project that we did in England kind of quite a few years ago now was a house which used the material system of the thatch building into its walls Of course, not the roof. It's a sort of a, let's say, can I say contemporary building for a house in the country in Lancashire. And our use of the thatch was aiming to actually reuse what was this local material system into its new kind of configuration. Of course, the irony was that so-called local thatch was imported from Turkey to Lancashire in order to be more economical. And finally, a set of infrastructural objects become important in our sort of, let's say, archaeology of objects of hybrid formation. And infrastructures, again, it's like engineering discipline. They're supposed to have a certain kind of primacy in the way that their logical sort of rationality precedes the design intention of, let's say, poetic creation of space, or this idea that we create beauty, etc. And so these, they are affect atmospheres and there are environmental flows. So the informality ecologies of topographic extra large and territorial objects become diffusers of this like subjective role, this notion of the subject, of the designer as the primary author. And one of the land art, Robert Smitson, who was also a land art artist, took a trip along New Jersey. He called this project Monuments of the Passaic. And he's looking at the debris of modernist architectures, high architecture, where it sort of translates into these objects strewn in the landscape. A lot of them are work, but some of them still there. And so the aesthetic of this, the actual environment, atmosphere, this is where Quasi thing comes in. The atmosphere that they create proposes a different attitude towards valuing what is the idea of design, not only in terms of intent, but in terms of what Timothy Hyde, who is a historian of architecture, has called it indifferent objects. Objects that don't want to please you, they don't want to accommodate you necessarily. They have had a function and then they are dispersed. So it's part of, let's say, some kind of a waste, but nevertheless, they actually have a way in which the environment, they create an atmosphere in the environment. So for us as a precedent, become important to actually recognize this kind of low intensity design intentionality. A little bit, perhaps, I really appreciated the way in which we're talking about the program of the buildings when they, you want to reduce the typological content and program content to actually let it become much more intersubjective. And another category of this kind of infrastructural design are these super scale large energy collectors which occupy sites of oceans. And they, one could actually argue that there is a sort of monument of the 21st century can be thought of as we experience them in their super large scale. Or environments of humidity and airflow that become space and they disappear. One of our projects in Keelung, which was a super long kind of promenade happening on the water, was a piece of infrastructure which wanted to create this kind of geotechnical form on the space. And it had a certain, let's say, sectional bridge. It was a hybrid between a bridge and a geotechnics, which would sit hovering over the bay in Keelung. Or another instance of a project which This was a competition, which we didn't win, of course, but nevertheless, we were selected. It was a question of doing a project for a archaeology museum in Salerno. It's actually now built, I noticed, I think, by Zaha Hadid. And the idea of doing a building object as piece of infrastructure itself, which was a tunnel, and the tunnel was a sort of horizontal object that became a building as a vertical. So this kind of digital model is a translation of that object of the infrastructural carving and the vertical building design. So between its role as a bridge over the landscape and as a tunnel inside the earth is a sort of hybrid that leads the design. So finally, we're just getting to what I have discovered. A lot of our Japanese friends are very good at this. Actually, also, I have an example from a French. This idea of loose fit island space. So buildings become looser things, and they actually invite outside world, whether it's environment or social space of the city. And perhaps I think I found that this building does a bit of that quite happily, in the way that it, I understood that Luisa and Matthias have cut these spaces into what might have been their site, and have invited the city to interact, or openings, and made activities, and this kind of making the organization of objects a loose fit thing becomes productive rather than, let's say, mega structures of totalities. So this is a very famous house that Pippo, I think, wrote about in the Japanese house project by Nishizawa, which actually diffuses the house into individual rooms. And what happens is, obviously, the space between the rooms become a certain kind of urbanity, and create chance of performative chance between program of each room in relation to externality. So there is a sort of inside, turning inside to an outside. It's not just inside outside, but it is like inside out of the project, which I find very interesting. And of course, it tells you of all the chance kind of occupations that make this relationship of one to somebody else, one room to another room, much more incidental and kind of quite lovely. And the instance of this, which is very, I find, very clever and very ingenious, is in design of Lacaton Vassals projects, where they actually produce all this unconditioned, environmentally unconditioned space, which perforate the space of the object, and they make these rooms, buildings, let's say, that float in the sea of unconditioned space. And in that sense, they do two things. One is the sort of economically the generosity to the space that is provided. And then there is a way in which these things allow unpre-planned programs to happen, and welcomed and superimpose what are very core spaces of, let's say, cars and parking and storage, to become performative spaces for this school of architecture at Nantes, where things happen for social spaces. And this is the example of that school. So the final category that I want to say, and I don't know if you would agree with me, but I find that there is a sort of sensibility at work here, which is not just, let's say, innocent in terms of its object formation, but we are sort of driving towards a certain kind of resistance to what used to be symbolic representation, iconic design of buildings. And I've called it attenuated aesthetic, so extreme affective dispersal of surface and environmental mass. This you might, I'm sure Louisa would recognize this, Tacitodine's super large drawing photographs of these super large masses of geology, ice and snow. And so this idea of our relationship to object becomes this, we're this very little thing in relation to Earth as an object. And this kind of produces situates us in a very different way to how we think of objects as manageable subject-object relationships. And it's significant what actually how Tacitodine has been able to touch the cultural impact of her work has been amazing. Now I read that they are sending one of her photographs to every embassy of United Kingdom all over the world. So there is a certain kind of recognition of the big Earth and the objecthood of the big Earth, which is kind of significant in as much as there is a scale and there is a, let's say, informality to it, out of controlness, which I believe is a sort of definition of Quasi thing. And this beautiful project of Sana, the Louvre Lens, which completely defies its own objecthood, but of course in a kind of highly attenuated but highly attentive design, which makes the, let's say, line of the facade bend just so that it diffuses light and refracts the reading of the landscape around it. So the question of the object become ones which completely want to deny its objecthood, and either by scale or its high caliber design qualities. I find exactly that kind of high attenuation, but also absolute deliberateness about achieving it in the work that we have seen, of course, above. It's amazingly attentive, but also trying to recede its subjecthood in the work of the sort of pigmented tiles, in the object's formation, and in the reception of the world, which is the idea of Quasi thing. So I just want to say one sort of summary, if I may. So with these examples, we show various degrees of chance engagement. Various degrees of chance engagement with nature or the artifice as design simulations or direct material processes, I believe as quasi things of attenuated aesthetic qualities, or as distantiated object resistance to symbolic representation, as sightings within the larger natural or topographic environments, and as iterative material processes in vernacular or culturally situated found objects. They become incorporated into the design. They represent a set of tendencies and strategic positions, which though may not be historically new, they map an interest in our position as subject of design or recipient of their affect as living things. I've tried to show some instance of achieving this assemblage of chaotic references, of negotiating openness and reciprocity in the way architecture has opened itself to turbulences and positive vulnerabilities within the world around us as live things. I hope this was clear enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That was quite radical, and I'm sure we will discuss it now. If you can please ask the speakers to join for a final discussion. And if I can immediately encourage everybody, both the speakers of this morning and also everybody else, to join in the debate, I'd be very happy. Are we missing someone? No, we were only four. So if I kind of try and summarize what has been said in the afternoon session provocatively, I think you were talking about the disappearance of architecture, no? I mean, it's architecture seems to have become quite a sort of defensive pursuit. And I would maybe like to start off the discussion with this question. I mean, Luca was asking about form this morning, which I thought was a dumb question, but then it turned out to create a very interesting debate. So maybe I'll ask a similarly sort of categorical question about program, because you were also speaking about program. So do you want to maybe expand on the importance, I mean, or this dialogue between form and program, and the importance of program in both education, but also in the kind of, well, architecture to come is a big word, but I mean, the sort of, maybe the roadmap ahead. Do you want to start?
Yes. What about now? Right, right. Rock and roll. Allora. No, in my experience, I found that all this discussion is about the turning of a century. And turning of centuries are interesting moments because they create clashes. And I think the most interesting thing in most of the aspects of our culture and in architecture is the product of this clash. So I think for me, form, which is important, I mean, there's a lot of form finding even in Confluence. For me, form, the best way to produce form is to shape this clash, to try to, not even to control, but to stage this between the existing and the new thing you want, between what the thing is and what you want the thing to become. And this is how I think form can happen today in analog, I mean, mostly in analog, I think eventually in digital. So form for me now is the result of this conflict. Maybe it's my age because I bring with me the 20th century, but I'm very curious about the 21st century. And I like architecture to be the result of this conflict. I mean, what we did with students is clearly this, I think. And program is a tool. I mean, program was becoming diagram to make us happy when we were young. And it's still interesting. I mean, I love diagram in the Sejima sense, as Homa was implicating somehow. But most of our work is to analyze, investigate, expand, turn this conflict into architectural form. And I think it's quite interesting. I don't know, the first time I thought about the exhibition I did in 2011 in Maxi Recycle was in 1991, listening to a music. When you put one song on top of another one, like Nene Cherry or whatever. So this superimposition of the existing culture and the new culture is for me a big engine to create architecture meanings, and I think it's what makes architecture, even for a real white old male like me, interesting today. And another thing I would say, also, I think maybe, I have to say too many things for my English when I lecture, but also this idea that people tends to identify themselves as completely individual today. You write a tweet and you think you're fighting the government, and you're not. and we know how to design a house, but we don't know how to design a city. Somehow it's the same thing for me. And I like the way you did this, because this is recycling at the urban scale. And it works very well. So for me, form is very much the representation of the conflict between these two cultures we are dealing with, the old one, our approach to politics, for instance, and the contemporary one. I loved Homa's presentation because it's perfect for me. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I have to admit that I refrain. I actually warn my students, only in my studio. I'm not sort of suggesting that this has to be the rule for the world, but I think that the idea of a form, of space, of systems, of let's say material systems or spatial systems become more primary to me than the program, because first of all, the instability of program is one of its pleasures, you know, that we all misuse and use things that are not intended to, for reasons that they're not intended to, and therefore I wouldn't like to fix them too soon. Nevertheless, the idea that, so the misuse and abuse of these kind of definitions become important. We do that in structure, we do that in material system, but we also do it more frequently in program. So to me, therefore, program is a very delayed encouragement of producing something. Of course, we, you know, in profession, we have to take a stand vis-a-vis what programs as a discourse are at that moment of design. So there is a sense in which, for example, what museum was as a typology, I don't know, 20 years ago, and what it is now is completely different. Or it can be different even now in multiple occasions, etc. So I'm kind of more interested in the discursive potential of any of these categories, including program. And in one sense, I would say the less primary or initial it becomes, the more productive, in my view. That's why I chose to say quasi thing, because it actually pushes it to a certain kind of debased role of what architecture's, let's say, agenda can be, and leaves it much more open to chance of others participating in its development or in its formation as a discourse, as a discursive product. Oh, you have it.
Yep.
Sorry.
Maybe, thanks for this question, because not only this symposium, and especially your lovely emails, Luisa, to finish the text for your book, you really brought me into out of my comfort zone to think about certain things and to stay in line with the question, what is the meaning of all this? And I think it's a symptom, and it's a compliment, but it's a symptom that you as building architects are creating a symposium about the question, what is the future of our profession, but also the education. And for me, this is super important because you try to bridge the gap between practice and education or academia, and especially when you think of all the digital labs, blah blah blah, around the world, they are all doing the same in a certain way. And I think there's a misunderstanding why we have to do this. And the reality we have to acknowledge is that industry is far ahead and the companies are far ahead. So every company, every firm has its own special geometry task force group, the BIM experts, the facade experts. So why should we imitate the companies or the industry? Why should we compete as universities or as schools with that kind of technology-driven expertise. And the digital is, for me, is a tool to rethink everything. By the way, that's very hard, and it's super. You know, it makes you tired. So you're already on low battery. But it's the digital is a tool to bring you out of your comfort zone and to ask the question: and do we really have to imitate the industry? And I think your school is quite interesting because you have, at least as far as I understood correctly, you said we have to stop this imitation game, and we have to say, okay, why? And we have to develop our own position, more experimental, maybe more sophisticated, without theory. Okay, let's see. But you know, I appreciate this, and the program. To coming back to your question, I'm thinking of all these experiments of the 60s, the concrete art, Max Bill, but also Ungers, who always try to argue with that kind of program. I think this was back then an idea to somehow reflect technology. You know, the computers in the 60s and 70s, they come up with a program, so we have to do the same. So there was this imitation game on the wording level. But at least I can say the digital programs and also the data are a fantastic opportunity to reflect your own position. So it's not a question of anxiety or we want to ignore the dark side of this capitalism thing. I think we should address the dark side to reposition ourselves. Yeah.
No, I meant it as a functional program or kind of idea of use or process, if you like. I mean, I think there's there's something that we haven't really spoken about because obviously the discussion was more from a kind of maybe theoretical angle this afternoon. But when you look at it from the experience of a running office, all of these options and all of these phenomena, they are somehow there. They somehow appear, and we somehow have to deal with them, and we somehow react to it. But also, what most people don't take into the equation is that most of it doesn't work. There's a lot of stuff that actually fails. The computer program doesn't work, or the kind of this kind of great collaboration between all consultants or so doesn't work because the interface is not working or something, or somebody doesn't have the program, or is not really connected, or something like that. So there's a lot of improvisation going on, and I think architects are pretty good at that. And so I think there's almost you could say there's almost a kind of field for architect or people who are trained as architects to improvise in complex situations and somehow find ways of resolving seemingly insolvable conflicts, because that happens all the time on building sites, in design processes, and so on and so forth. And is that I found quite charming your kind of description of saying that you said, so the little things we know, or something like that, we kind of we feed into the process, and that's exactly. That's it. And some of the things we know are what you were describing as the sort of subject of your non-courses, namely creativity, intuition, somehow thinking out of the box or thinking laterally, and kind of finding solutions to in maybe unprescribed ways to problems that are simply there. But it's partially also to do about skills, actually. It's to do also about knowledge, material, it's knowledge of construction, it's knowledge of process management, it's knowledge of communication. A lot of it is communication, as a matter of fact. And so I'm wondering, I mean, when your students arrive at Confluence, do they come with the intention to become architects, or do they come with the intention to just learn something? And if so, what?
No? Yeah, it works? Okay. the experience is too young, I think, to really, to have like a proper answer. Clearly, the first students I showed on the picture, the 6 first that came with, like they clearly quit a real school with a real diploma to come here. They want to be architects, and they wanted to come and build like a new way of. So they were like pioneers, you know, like they came with an idea, and most of them, they are still around the school, and sometimes they come and teach, and they're part of the adventure. The rest, now that we are growing and becoming a little bit more normal, it's like every school. I think like if you ask this question in most schools, they don't know what they. I mean, some do, but most of them won't become architects. Like statistically, so. Well, that should be also a question for architectural schools. And then the one that will want to come and be architects, and as great architects as you can be, like with very nice buildings. We're not saying that we're not going to give them the opportunity to become that. So we're not saying you shouldn't learn structure, for example. We're just saying the way you learn it is different. And I think also one other idea is like every building is a prototype. No, so how can you teach? How can you teach a discipline where every time it's different? Every time every time you have to react. Every time you have to invent. And I think you have to give the tools, which are not necessarily the technicality. No, that would be the vision of the school.
I mean, in our experience, the thing grows, you know, I mean, the knowledge grows. I mean, every facade is, yes, somehow like the facade before, but then it's also different. And it's sort of somebody who has been designing the facade last time, designs facade this time, will kind of know more and will build up. So, I mean, you have to start somewhere, you know, you have to have a sort of some basis of knowledge from which you can grow. But I would like to open, maybe Louisa, you want to comment on what's been said?
I have quite a few comments, but I'll limit it to one, otherwise it'll take too long. It goes back to something that Homa said at the beginning of her talk, which was when you said that you were talking about the draw, love, build, the words of our exhibition, and you said that love needs, in terms of the involvement of the architect or in the project, it needs a displacement of the self. And I thought that was incredibly interesting comment. It relates a bit to what we were talking about over lunch, which wasn't necessarily about architecture, but somehow, and again, I mean, in terms of what we're trying to do with our office now, with our structural change, is taking it away from the two named partners, although Lucas, you've moved chair. Lucas has been with us for nearly as long as we've been with us. And now we have 16 more lovely partners who are all here today. And it's somehow getting into a new way of operating, and which has been going on for some time in both the art world and the architecture world. But how that is perceived by the public, I think, is important. But I suppose the question, yeah, is twofold. It's how this sort of love one needs for the world, for our fellow beings, for each other, how one addresses that in architecture, and somehow, yeah, my question's not very clear, but getting away from authorship and more authenticity in what one is really trying to achieve, which may not be to do with what something looks like, what a lot of people think is the main thing we're doing, but it's actually not. I don't know if I've made a question there, Homa, but maybe you can continue.
Is it on? Okay. Well, I personally don't think what you're doing is what I mean, I try to actually explain that I feel that you are making these extreme, I would call them extreme, but in the kind of attenuated way in which objecthood is questioned, actually, in a very fine kind of deliberate distanciation of yourselves. Of course, I know what you go through in order to achieve that. So I am not at all in denial, but it's a fine art. And I want to recognize that perhaps it's a little bit of a, let's say, dreaming, I would say, just to be provocative, I would say dreaming is not enough. And so authorship is overstated, let's say, and you can actually, of course, it's very important. I don't want to say that it's not. One has to that become important so that you actually learn how to study, how to pick up information as you need it. So it's actually a model. Business school, the same at Harvard, does precedent models. So this way you learn how to learn, and you learn to equip yourself to take a position. I think, therefore, dreaming is maybe a very good big first step, but you need to get it to become productive in a very specific way. And my suggestion was that there is a degree of, let's say, distance from the self that becomes, whether it's a knowledge or whether it's a research, that make it become not simply mine. I think perhaps authorship has been overstated in my view. And therefore I would, let's say, in architecture, I like the instances where authorship is also diffused by way of techniques of work or by way of participation or engagement of other systems of, let's say, production of form or production of process. That's all I wanted to say, not to devalue that kind of imaginative potential, of course, but it just takes so much thing, you know, like what you were saying, what you have to do in the office. I mean, in the program that you chose, the one that you script, you know, I have a, you know, in my school also, there's a high level of digital knowledge. So they produce all these kind of transformative things, completely bewildering and beautiful, but there is a moment where you have to say what criteria makes one become better than the other, and that becomes a question of knowledge that is transformative and questioning, rather than just saying that if you imagine, you know, no matter, not to deny its importance.
You want to?
No, I just like an anthropological comment. I mean, I always tended to be a rebel, but probably I would have hated my school if the school wanted to teach me to be a rebel. No, so that maybe it's my generation. No,
you'd become a proper
we don't want
citizen.
to. The point is not to say no. I know it's interesting. The point is not to say be a rebel or be egotistic author. The idea is simply be yourself, and that's not so easy, and it's I think I mean, again, I would ask the question to somebody born in 2000 and to reply for this architect thing. Architecture will be changing so radically. I mean, and by the way, the students I showed, he comes from Harvard. He's not from our school, and I was pointing this because they are, and he's from Harvard, and he trained as an architect, probably wanting to be an architect, fell into the script disease, and then was hired by a company to replace architects.
I mean,
So the question is what architects will become, and I'm not sure we have the answer. No. And I'm sure that raising the question in an architectural school, saying these are the tools architects use, now you can use it to act on the world as you want. And it's not necessarily producing a building as we know it, because buildings as we know it must change, or should have changed.
Maybe.
Okay.
You know, my house was built in the 13th century. What's new in the building I live is power, bathroom, internet, heating, and so maybe the change we're going through will be infinite. But I'm not sure this is going to be so physical. It's going to be so reflected in our architectural space, because this you can help us for this. The power of the digital is just that it doesn't give a shit to what's the physical that holds it around. So, and this is a big danger also for us, no? So I think none of us knows the answer, but it cannot be, and you know, it's very strange because our old master, William Venice, would have told us an architect should never even pronounce the word future. No, the architect words for today. But I mean, should not, this is what they thought. I do not subscribe, but should we stop doing things, doing what we can do, what we know how to do, to improve people's life today, because we don't know what architecture will be tomorrow? Probably not. And I sympathize. I know I said it. No, I love to give the school in the hands of students. This is what I try to do all the time. But it's a difficult question, I think, to know. I mean, the risk of freezing because you don't know what you will be is very, very dangerous, I think. But I mean, this is not about compliance. It's a general discussion.
Yeah, and also since you're interested in this, Michel Serres, I mean, his idea of this chaotic contemporary is exactly about, you know, future now is not so different in as much as we are not the same as, you know, 15th century or 13th century in our chaotic relationship to history. I'm not saying we live the same lives, but we have a chaotic ensemble. And that relationship to time or technology or the systems of our space making or relational conditions remains chaotic. No doubt it will be different ensemble, but it is an ensemble which includes us, and it's an iterative condition of what we know and what we will know or what we may not know, as a sort of a chaotic thing.
Very interesting.
I also would like to kind of somehow come up in defense of professionalism, which obviously, because obviously, if you equalize professionalism with you know, stupid repetition and sort of like expert knowledge that is kind of cast in stone, then it becomes more of a hindrance than helpful in a design or in any kind of process of making something, producing something, letting something grow, whatever. But at the same time, you know, an informed opinion, an opinion that is experienced and knows what it takes, for example, to go through these complex processes. I mean, as Eric has been showing this morning, and to, for example, understand what potential sleeps or is latent in the decision of some kind of quantity engineer to turn the welded joints into riveted joints. You know, that is actually really that's an asset. And what I was talking about a little bit in the introduction, the continued quantification of whatever we do, and I think that data-based design is some kind of quantification, really leads to the question, who in the end kind of puts some soul into the whole thing, you know, who makes sure that it's not going to be just a banal kind of machine-made product, maybe very refined as such, but in the end, without this Wesen, you know, without personality in a way, without life. And I think, I mean, a lot of it, I mean, obviously it doesn't have to be an architect, it's not necessarily just an architect's diploma, it could be an artist or anything, but it has to be somebody who has developed this type of sensitivity and sensuality, who kind of understands what it means to change from welt to rivet, right? As a cultural project, not necessarily as a technical project. And I do think that architects have a role there, but I mean, obviously they have to fight their place. And that respect, I was very interested in your statement that we need a law, a law that kind of makes sure that architecture happens. I think there is something like that. There's an initiative in Italy, you know, to somehow create that. Maybe you want
France
to.
has a law.
France has a law that excludes all architects from like 90% of architecture.
Law don't work.
It's true, because all the above under certain square meters, it's not no architects. Yeah, so laws are also
No,
find
but
a good law.
no, but about the law, this idea of the law of architecture is only because in Italy we never talk about architecture when we have to deal with profession, with the practice. We have to deal with some laws that are called norme, testo unico per l'edilizia, which means building, but it's something that I think it's very different from the words and the feelings of architecture. I mean, sometimes reduce in a way, no, the possibilities or the power of architecture. And architecture is something that can be defined also in terms of building, of course, but also in terms of art, such as Odile Deck tried to do in her school, in the school she tried to have. So in this sense, I'm asking for Italy, I did this appel for architecture. It's like a sort of appello per l'architettura, because I think that we lost the sense of architecture in the very ordinary professional moments of everyday life. And so it is related with this. I think that I trust in architecture. I mean, in all these sfumature, we call it in Italian, no? And instead, if we do not have a public, if we do not have the government which recognize the importance of architecture, it's very difficult then to give the right response, but also to pose the right questions. Like today, I try to show you, or to through my personal experience, of course.
But we will be saved by Ursula, no? Now Ursula will save us with architecture.
Architect form for this planet. Santa Ursula.
I mean, the history of the Maxi started by us trying to write a law. Now, the law never came, luckily, because I don't believe in the law. But it was very difficult in this country. This is very Italian, so they would be bored about this. In Italy, it was very difficult to advocate for architecture when we knew what architecture was. You can imagine how hard it will be today when we have no idea of what architecture is and will be. So forget it, Fernanda. I'm sorry. Forget.
I will not forget.
No, I know, but we will lose. We will lose. We will lose.
Are there any more comments or questions in the audience? Are you sure? Say your name.
Georg, you said that data is a question of mindsets and not of data sets. That's great. That's good to hear. And you were talking about the UN, the new open, and the possibly utopian in the sense of difficult to get there, but hopefully not the fact of having a totally freely accessible set of data for the planet, I think is fantastic. But then the question that then came about 10 minutes later is that there's how do we as people with emotions and feelings and poetic sensibilities trained by our teachers, how do we manage to interpret the data? Because there's so much of it. How can we? That's the question.
I don't have the perfect answer, but I think two comments. I think the idea of an open data society, it's not an idea that I'm, proposing or fighting for, but I have a feeling that this is one of the most interesting theory of or about the future society, kind of a vision. So I feel there's a power in this idea of an open society or open data society, but also a kind of dystopian sound. And this is quite interesting, to be honest. If we don't have a vision which is dystopian, it's more a bit, too softy. And because then it's like, having a warm shower. It's like there's nothing that makes you think or reposition yourself. It's just agreeing. I agree that we should agree. So okay, and that's what's the next point, So, and I think this kind of mindset, data set idea is, let's say, the hope that our discipline is possible to conceptualize this kind of new aspects, to work on these questions, to develop answers, to develop skills, how to evaluate, how to filter all this information. Because in your pocket and in my jacket, it's information, it's not the knowledge. We're creating knowledge here on stage because we are creating complexity. So we are processing information in an intellectual way, but the information is in your pocket, you're right. But that's not, that's not the answer. So schools and our discourse here is about creating knowledge, which means dialogue or discussion or, creating a problem. The information in your pocket is not a problem. It's always an answer to anything. There's no problem anymore. It's too easy. And so we have to create problems.
No, but I have a question for you. Can I?
Yeah.
I mean, don't you think that this? I mean, what Luisa was asking in the end is this: we need like communication channels between the digital world and the real world, and the way these communication channels will work will have a big impact on democracy, social justice, knowledge, information control. So this is, I think, what we are. We're not like, I'm not a digital native. I'm scared of this. I'm very interested in how this is going to work and how can we contribute to make this work well.
This is a very good point, and I think the risk is the speed of the media. And this is why I say that we have to reinvent the building. We have to focus on buildings again, not because I am super conservative in a way, but I think a building is a super slow medium. And I think we can use buildings to slow down the speed of discourse a bit. And this is one point why I like to rethink the building as a slow medium, and we need slow media for democracy. So otherwise, it's just a question of shoot and drive, or the Twitter messages are just very like a shot. It's very, there's no message behind. It's just
or me fighting with the wheel.
It's just a fight. Yeah. But I want just to give you one aspect to your wonderful school idea, because I think you made me think when you said, just we want to teach the students just be yourself or something, you said. And I think I'm not totally in line with that, you know, because we are all products of the tech industry, we're all products of Nike, you know, just do it. And I think there's always this kind of dark side, I'm sorry, but you know, there's a creative industry, you know, take Google or take, you know, all these Silicon Valley companies. They have the same glossary like you. You know, it's about creativity, it's about curiosity. We need the new people inventing the future. It's about, you know, you can do whatever you want. And then the question is, what's the difference between Google and your school? And this is an interesting thing, right? And then it becomes interesting also for Matthias, who said, yeah, what's then the skills of an architect? You know, is it just be like a Google employee? Yeah, we're super, you know, there's curiosity, we're creative, and we can, you know, there's this gamification in the air, but it's a private company. And I think you mentioned something very important, and this is the public. And that's the difference between architecture as the discipline and the tech companies, which is a private company. They can, you know, they can do these things the entire day, create, you know, this kind of and adapting all the Bauhaus, you know, and Monte Verita ideas, and you know, Black Mountain College, you know, everything is out there in Silicon Valley, I guess. But the public is the difference, and this is another aspect why I think the Open Data Society has this public in it somehow, and this is a chance for us, also for democracy, I think, to you know, to address this public, to work with the public, even in you know, as citizen science, or we have to create new concepts to you know, to keep this dialogue with the public. Otherwise, Google will be better.
Yeah, can I
thank
respond?
you.
It was
yes. Just go first.
Sorry?
Just go first.
No, I'm just going to respond. It was a very bad caricature. But you're right. But you're right. Well, first of all, just do it. You know, in architectural schools, it wouldn't be so bad. Meaning, when you enter an architectural school, anyway, you hear a lot of talking. And just do it. You know, it would be good to write this in architectural studios, especially in France, where philosophy is too much used instead of like just designing. So just doing is not that bad. And then you're right. No, you're right. It's then what do you replace it with? No, yeah, and it's not that bad to be to try and maintain curiosity. And just I'm going to make a remark, because you're totally right. It's not knowledge, it's data. I mean, this is precisely precisely why. It's precisely why I at one point I showed that we removed the courses, the spatial strategy where one speaks to and gives information to all, and we replaced it by seminars where actually we teach them how to get in the information, how to process it, how to be critical, how to take a position, and at the end of the semester, they'll have in December have a debate, no, and the end of the semester is debating. Yeah. So I mean, it was a low kick. Sorry.
Yes, maybe just to take up, because we are talking about the future of the architectural profession, and so I thought it was very good that you end with the question of what the profession is. And I think it would be a missed opportunity to have in the end like this false position of abolishing the profession or keeping it and saving it. And so it would help to look at the word profession means a public greed. So taking up your question of public, I think what is missing is how do we define ourselves before the public? What is that which we do for the public? And what is at the core of what we do? So the medicine have the Hippocratic Oath. This is their profession. So before the public, they say they will save lives. So what is this, what architects do, and what is that what we confess before the public? So professio, the Latin word, the public creed. And this is what we have to think about. What is that we have to like take an oath before the public? Serving the capital, building assets, producing 40% of carbon dioxide. What is it? So, and I think to not to fall into these false positions, we have to redefine again what would we now today in the 21st century see as our professio.
I just, well, this is working. I mean, I don't know. Maybe when we think about what happened to the profession of medicine after 19th century, it's already. I mean, Foucault has already told us, warned us about how these things actually become something other than, you know, like Hippocratic Oath versus insurance companies in America, for example, in terms of the way that they would decide what medicine to give or who to prioritize, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I don't want to be gloomy, but anyway, that is a little bit gloomy. So I don't think, and so the architecture profession that Eric was kind of his photograph of his pet peeves versus the ones that, you know, we all love and enjoy. And you were saying who carries the soul of the building beyond what is a sort of constructional bottom line or least path of least resistance. I think perhaps Eric and you referred to it. So profession is a problematic thing after the 19th century anyway. Wouldn't you agree? So now it comes to a question of how, what kind of professions can we decide to have, whether there is an architecture who a sense of responsibility vis-a-vis others, whether it's public or other. I would probably expand it to others, which is more like the story of architecture profession versus the history of architecture profession. There is a way in which we construct the character for the, you know, these firms who are actually aspiring to something very specific beyond themselves. You know, it stays for posterity. There is a sort of responsibility. Even though you might say in each project there is a public that is different. So I just want to make that distinction because profession has a history in itself and has developed in, you know, in Japan, it works differently than in America. I just happen to, you know a few of them. But so at this moment in time, I think this business of differentiating what kind of professions we're talking about is worth it, because then it's not just one person, it's just the way in which that person sees others.
But this could be another trembling paradigm today. I mean, in our schools, we were taught that to pursue our art, we should betray the client every minute. So we should make the client think he was happy, but we were doing our thing. If you'd ask Giorgio Grassi to build a house for your dog, he will submit a project for a library. Literally, this is not exaggeration. This is not a joke. It was exactly like this. So this is how we were trained. That there is this wonderful 90 years old architect in Ascoli, a very old man. He was like a Zevi follower. With my students, we went to his archive. He has two archives: buildings, architecture. It's separate. So when the client can be cheated, it becomes architecture. When the client cannot be cheated, it's just building. So is this new series is the new way you have to deal with ecology, with technology, with equality, gender equity? Is this going to change this paradigm? I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. And I think it's very interesting because, for instance, the whole system of architecture schools in Italy is based on this. You secretly pursue your art, cheating the client.
Well, I mean, I think there are certainly a few symptoms of hope at this point. We have quite a number of clients recently who understand that they cannot quite continue as they have done, and they're really looking for our advice or looking for companionship or complicity in somehow trying to find a new way. I mean, and this is mostly concentrating on carbon dioxide and recycle, circularity and so on. But at the same time, it seems to also be clear that with sufficiency, somehow you just cannot carry on buildings that are like financial products that somehow are again being just put out and put on the market. So that there does seem to be a change, and I would also like to support at least some clients. I mean, the best projects really come about with good clients, and it's very, very difficult. I mean, we've done this as well, kind of. We wouldn't call it cheating the clients, but I mean, we maybe call it delivering more than he had expected, right? They were somehow...
That's what we consider. This is like the collector for the art.
Sometimes,
it's a collector.
Sometimes surprised.
Yeah.
But not to the detriment of the project, I think. But anyway, it's obviously subjective. But there are clients now, well, they always have been, I presume, who are kind of interested to create something really sustainable, not just in technical sense, but also in a kind of cultural sense. But anyway, are there any other questions or comments that you want to make? Please, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say that obviously, we're talking about the architectural profession. One thing that schools of architecture seem to get very wrong, to me, so it's interesting, just throw it out there, is this sort of focus on the individual. If you go to film school, there's a really interesting sense in which actually there are a whole set of responsibilities and talents that are encouraged in different spheres. So I just wanted to say that in the room, fantastic teams, from your office. And actually the teams are made up of complementary talent. So I would sort of defuse the question of the architectural profession as the individual and just mention the collective.
Nice.
There's a great spatial the organization called the Archaeological, which builds a collective with individualities, and it has proven very efficient in ancient Greece.
We know them, yes.
Then it's right. Then it's right.
Sorry?
Then it's right. If it's proven from ancient Greece, then it's...
You have only one rule: anything but TV.
So any other comments?
It's an innocent question. No, I like the notion of Odile Deck. First have a dream, but I really wonder, what dreams are we talking about? So my first question is, what dreams do the students bring to your school? And then a question is, what do you dream about yourself?
This is Chino Zucchi's
Question, what was the question? What
do the students dream?
Well, come visit. Come visit. Well, first of all, they have different dreams, and I don't think that's a bad thing. It's like 2 or 3 comments that I sense that the individuality is a problem. And I ask myself, why we have this tendency to be reassured by producing clones in architectural schools? And that's a real issue. But because it's a real issue, I mean, all architectural schools in the world today are aiming to be to train professionals. I mean, they want, because they need to produce individuals that are operative in the market. And it has to do also with the context, because you're not going to pay for education if you don't get a job afterwards, etc., etc. So, I mean, I see more, or maybe the presentation was more radical than we really are. But the question is out there, and
I will say individualism is not a problem in itself.
apparently it is.
No, for me the problem is we have tools, paradigms, schools, programs that are thought for mass society, for the 20th century, that are designed for the 20th century. If you have to deal with individualism, which is a feature of our society, you need to update a few things. Also because to be alone sometimes can be fun, sometimes can be weakness. So I mean, to turn this into a political discourse, it will be complicated. But I have nothing. I have no moral judgment about individualism. I don't want to be defeated as an individual because of this. I want to know which tools, which channel of communication, which media I can use to make my individualism useful to personal achievement and collective achievement. I think. So
and just to answer, honestly, I wouldn't know how to answer at the place of the students. I was very much. I think it's in your presentation. You said the new generation, they feel quite confident, but the only thing that they still don't know is how to make a difference. I think you said something like this. And this I experience every day. I feel that the students, they all have like a great ability to deal with the new technologies but I think they didn't. What they're lacking is putting themselves out there, and I would say that this is the thing we have to help them. So dreams, their dreams is, I imagine it's easy for them to find. The difficult part is how to make a difference now. And
actually, there are quite a few of them sitting in the room, I think. So
what do you dream? I only remember bad dreams. That's.
Thank you. I would say I'm not different than you. We are all humans, one society, I guess. I think what is different is the time. So time changed. We are at the end of liberalism, I guess, after the fall of fascism and communism. Now even liberalism is in a crisis. If you follow historian, you all know Harari. So I would say time is different. So in personality, I'm so close to my grandfather, so you can't say I'm different. But what I would say, and I think it's about this future thinking of today, and what is future thinking? And I think what is also just got out of university and still there, studying teaching and working in a profession. What I think that is different in university now is that we start to implement a lot more art thinking rather than design thinking. So what we are in the classic way are trained is, okay, we assume in architecture that there is a problem, and then we draw a lot until we love it, and then we build it. And I think what art thinking is, and what we try to encourage also, and I was also encouraged in a very contemporary way of teaching, is okay, trying to engage the students to come up with the right questions. So rather than design thinking, like we should ask what is actually the problem, what's the problem of the future? And that is also what I want to give to you as a question to the podium. What's your question for the future that you would like to be solved, the urgent one? So yeah, maybe you could respond.
Thank you for this, because I try to address this question as a title of my talk. I have no answer, but I think I have a feeling that it's at least personally speaking, a very huge and somehow important question of relevance. What is design in the age of data? I mean, it's not fabrication, it's not GeoBIM, It's not, you know, computational blah blah blah. It's not, but it's what is design. So what is actually design in a data society? So I'm interested in the kind of question, and you are totally right. It's about, you know, creating the right questions. And just to put one aspect in which was based in Dirk's presentation, I think not only art but also archives will be part of the next you know, generation. We have to open these archives and we have to question the archives in the right way to build, yeah, if you want, counter narratives or new narratives.
I just want to add to that one thing that I completely agree about your proposition is that studio operations of studio is one that actually goes beyond the education of architecture and has been recognized in, they call it studio thinking now, which is a very different mode of addressing, let's say, how to make a question, because the question and the answer go circular. And in that sense, there's a sort of experimentation that is partly intuitive, partly your digital models enable you to think laterally and then come back to the same question. So this kind of studio model is a very interesting thing that has been helped by the digital you know, scripting and all those programs that allow us to use data in ways that become spatial or become program alternatives, etc. So I find that to become very productive in the way in which one might diffuse this business of knowledge as a sort of established, only established precedent to what becomes sort of productive beyond itself vis-a-vis these alternative data modelings that can actually start a new kind of game of what is a building, what is a aesthetically warm shower, whatever, you know, like there is a sense in which we make these decisions at the desk and we can hardly even articulate it, how we do it, but it actually recirculates. And it's very important when the studio is recognized in that kind of capacity beyond just me or the knowledge that is accumulated.
I would like to answer that question as well. What do we expect to be resolved by the architectural profession in the future? I would like to echo what has been said this morning, the nostalgia for the city. I mean, I would like to be able to live in the city, and I would also like to have my whatever nephews, nieces, and other kind of successors be able to live in the city that is worth living in, that is kind of, you know, has beauty, has kind of capacity, has kind of space, has place, has kind of somehow is an environment that is both inspiring and comfortable, also challenging, interesting, and is kind of not just anything, you know, that is kind of really made by people and is kind of people visibly has an effort, carries an effort and an ambition, and somehow is worth kind of producing. And I think that's sometimes or it feels a little bit that it's maybe endangered, or as kind of production modes change, as values change, as selection processes change, as the professional field changes, it's definitely different from what it used to be. I can say that looking 30 years back, but you know, it's not to say that it's worse necessarily, but I mean, we have to be aware and we have to keep on watching, and as kind of processes change, as tools change, and so on and so forth, the content tends to change as well. So we somehow have to be just aware and try and reflect what's going on. And somehow, I mean, I also, it sounds maybe old-fashioned, also believe in this kind of idea of a profession in the sense of a responsibility towards the public. So, any other questions, please? Thanks.
Hi. So Sorry, I'm a little nervous, but I'm a student as well, architecture student, obviously. And I've seen that from my professors, they were raised and taught in an era on which architecture, solving the world's problem was building housing, and also that meant that the biggest problem of the world was, at least, or maybe of my country, was that we don't have enough housing, and then we should always build and build and build. And now we are talking about the future of the architectural profession, and the future means also that we have earth to live in some years from now. And when we talk about architecture and climate change, I would like to ask you, how can we tackle climate change and the future of the world in in terms of not being not being an answer, a technical answer, not being an answer that comes from I don't know, carbon storage calculations or something like that, but a matter of architecture, of space, and of creation of art somehow. I know it's also not a direct, objective and question, but thank you.
So we all resign and we all leave only Cucinella to build buildings. I, may I answer because of this? I mean, we built our architectural knowledge on this housing culture. You said it. Modernism was about that. The Italian hegemony was also about that. The only problem is sometimes people didn't really like to inhabit those houses. This is an the problem today is, I think we need to take care. What we love in Japanese architecture is that the architects keep this dialogue with society, starting by the house, not by the housing, by the house. So the first thing I think to communicate to the people, because you understand what a house is and how you can help them, and then also build something that it's interesting for you. So house versus housing is an interesting point, I think, today. The other thing, we don't need much housing. There's so many empty houses, for instance, in this country, that it makes no sense to think in terms of housing anymore. But I think climate change, for us, it's interesting if we can. I mean, there's no ethics. For us, we need an aesthetics to propose an ethics. So, the recycle show I did was about this, about challenging architects to turn a social and an ecological need into art, let's say, or into something that can deserve our contribution. Other ways, I think we can just we can tell the city that it's better to recycle a neighborhood than to build a new neighborhood somewhere else. That M9 is much better here than to build a new big complex somewhere else. We can tell the people that they should regenerate their houses and so on, but then we can leave room to technicians because they can do solar panels, things, energy much better than us. We need to turn these needs into something that has a meaning, that has a formal, visual, communicational, whatever meaning. Otherwise, we will not be able to give a contribution. I mean, what they do is to try to turn future into some forms somehow, or to interpret future into some forms. We have to do the same in many different ways, with different approaches, with different techniques, but I think we cannot leave the future of the world in the hands of engineers or chemical engineers or technicians. We need to, and since I do have the fear that the digital world does not have a face. That's what I think, is the digital world does not mean a physical difference. So we need to create a physical feature for the world to match the changes, the needs, the new technologies. But we have our field. We have our field. I mean, they are wonderful examples of how to develop this field. So we need to keep a little core that it's our field of investigation, which is not only depending on technology, climate issues, and so on and so forth. We need to have, I mean, somebody was calling it art. You can call it whatever you want. Because I would not expect architecture. I would not expect music, poetry, literature, whatever, to be so self-destructive as architecture is in this field. I mean, I would advise you to go to Fondazione Prada. There is an exhibition, maybe less beautiful than some other exhibitions in Fondazione Prada, but we are in the post-Celland time, and it's Stop Painting. The Stop Painting exhibition is an exhibition of paintings. So, isn't this interesting for us?
That's a final word. Perfect. So, thank you again to our speakers for coming here, for sharing their thoughts and insights, for enduring the kind of long day. It's been a real honor and pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody else for having the patience and for listening and contributing to the discussion. I hope you still have a few nice days here. We'll probably see each other tomorrow morning again. I think there's something like that. So anyway, have a nice evening and thank you.
Grazie.
Bye.